The Vikings might be one of the top themes for screen adaptations. That said, screenwriters and directors, to put it mildly, sometimes plainly deceive, presenting Vikings as ruthless both in battle and at home, warriors who were cruel and did not take objections from men in the household. In reality, though, this is not so, or not entirely so. The topic of today's episode is Vikings' love life. Keep watching. You're watching Flip Side of History. Right, so let us start from the very beginning. Upbringing. Family as well as sexual relations are pretty peculiar, and in many ways we can learn from the Vikings in today's world as well. Already from an early age, both boys and girls were brought up by the Vikings, as they say now, in terms of this. Children had a general idea of what love between a man and a woman is. It is both a relationship and intimacy. And specifically how the act of intimacy itself took place was also explained to the younger generation in great detail and in meticulous manner. Children knew that physical contact alone was not the main thing, that there was also romance and relationships, which were the foundation of family building, courtesy and marriage. But, of course, the courting itself was greatly different from modern traditions. For example, to express his affection, Viking had to collect a bundle of the most beautiful flowers around, then walk up to the object of adoration and smack the bundle right in the face. From that point, the only remaining thing to do was to wait for a mutual sign of affection. A young lady or a woman could simply sew a short for her man to show her affection, or in a very intimate Viking moment, a woman could brush the object of her affection's hair. In truth, the Vikings had a lot of interesting traditions. If a man and a woman liked each other, the woman would sit on the man's knees and the lovers would start kissing. And if the woman wanted to ask something of her lover or husband, she simply hugged him by the neck. As a side note, the Vikings treated the wedding ceremony with far more than scrupulous care. According to the Vikings themselves, a wedding that lasted less than 3 days was not even regarded as a wedding. It was like, sort of at the level of a neighborhood hangout. A whole torchlight procession accompanied the young to their first wedding night. Sometimes the newlyweds would also try to escape from the wedding ceremony. This was punishable by either a fairly serious fine or expulsion from the community itself. It is quite surprising that the woman in the family had far more rights than perhaps even modern women in their homes. She kept the hearth, organized receptions, took care of the children, and was heavily protected by Viking law. In the event of her husband's death, the widow had all the rights to the inheritance, but there were also not so pleasant moments, such as the divorce. The most interesting thing is that, for example, a woman could demand a divorce if her husband did not satisfy her in bed, and we mean in all senses, from lack of initiative to insufficient number of acts in one night. The Vikings took this process more than seriously. The very procedure of such a divorce consisted of several stages. It began at the family bed, then continued at the door of their house, and finally the divorce was formalized already at the people's meeting. The Vikings considered it a disgrace for a man to fail to satisfy during intimacy his own wife. For the sake of justice, it must be said that the husband had the right to assert exactly the same claims against his wife. It is true that there was no question of shame for a woman in this case. Divorce and bye-bye. That was pretty much it. Another interesting thing is another right of a woman. If she was abused in the family, i.e. if against her will, a Viking stepped in close relations with her, then at the people's meeting, the victim was officially recognized as chaste, so the Vikings protected their women quite substantially. Even though Viking men were fearless and ruthless warriors, they were no less romantic and poetic in their intimacy than either the Hindus or the Chinese. For example, the very fact of intimacy was called to rest with her, to enjoy each other's company, and to travel together and to get together in bed. Distinctive features. If a Viking had an outside marital affair with a free woman, there was a restriction. The mistress was strictly forbidden to make signs to another man. As a standard, the Vikings did not condemn, nor did they disapprove of, extramarital relations with free women. If, however, a child was born of such an affair, this child could claim his father's inheritance. For example, the unlawful offspring of a Viking leader or chief was one of the candidates for the throne. Here it must be mentioned that adultery, speaking gently, was not welcomed. If the lawful husband caught his wife in the arms of another man, he had all the rights to kill both of them. The Vikings considered it shameful to take another man's wife, as indeed it was shameful to take another man's property. Among the most interesting features of Scandinavian women was their preference for much older men, even the elderly. It was believed that an experienced man would give both pleasure in bed, and with him one could feel secure in every way. One of the Scandinavian sagas tell how Queen Ingebjorg was choosing between two suitors. The first was young Olaf, and the second was the rather old Getrik. Well, the woman chose Getrik because of the following. If you compare men to trees, Olaf has just begun to unfurl his spring leaves, while Getrik has already given beautiful crops. In other words, with a young husband, the future is rather blurred, but with an older husband, everything is clear, understandable, and certain. It should not be presumed that the Vikings were simply chaste and faithful to their wives. Capturing slaves from foreign lands allowed the Vikings to officially have objects in their home to satisfy their needs on the side. The lawful spouse did not dispute such things, understanding that the slave had no rights, sometimes even sending a maid on a campaign with her husband so that her husband would not suffer from the lack of a female tenderness. The most intriguing thing about Viking family relations is that from time to time so-called women's riots broke out within communities. For example, if a woman became annoyed that her husband was always busy with slave girls or did not give her the respect she deserved. In other words, one dissatisfied wife could easily gather a group of like-minded women around her who would start a real, in modern parlance, protest strike. The level of intensity of emotions was such that the severe and pitiless Vikings almost always yielded to their wives, complying with their demands. Of course, such a thing sounds simply unbelievable. But the fact remains that the reasons of wives' rebellions were considered in sufficient detail by the elders of the community, after which they did everything they could to make the women calm down. Otherwise, the consequences could have been the most unforeseen. When talking about captive women who became slaves and maidservants and had to satisfy all the whims of their lord, it is impossible not to mention men as well. The same-sex relationships were not officially condemned by the Vikings in any way. Naturally, the more passive element of the relationship was not considered to be male and was often looked upon with contempt. For this reason, captured men were subjected to violence by default. This was done to deprive them of their masculinity. That is, in this way, the Vikings deprived male slaves of their manhood for the rest of their lives, believing that a man who had become effeminate would be more prone to control. But ironically, historians admit that this also took place among the Vikings themselves. The Scandinavians did not condemn such relationships, they were quite tolerant. It was believed that the friend of the Viking would help him in all his affairs and aspirations. At the same time, the friend as a man was firmly convinced that he could no longer stand up for himself. This was in contradiction to the very principle of the Norse ideal, so a passive role in intimacy was considered a cowardice for men. Again, referring to the names of passive men, despite the contempt felt for them, it was still quite poetic. Insulting poems, offensive poet, coward or outlaw, troublemaker, pillar of shame, practitioner of female magic. In spite of the fact that the official history of the Vikings does not mention such relationships, they were condemned by the church in the 10th and 11th centuries when Christianity spread in Scandinavia, so we can assume that there was this kind of relationship as well. Thank you for watching this episode. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Also watch our other videos on Flip Side of History.